Welcome to the next in our series of virtual conventions. I'm very happy to turn the meeting over to Suzanne Singer, who will introduce our guest presenter for today.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be able to introduce Ilana Kaufman, who is the director of the Jews of Color Field Building Initiative. She formerly worked as the Public Affairs and Civic Engagement Director in the East Bay for the San Francisco, California-based Jewish Community Relations Council. She's got 20 years of leadership, community building, and organizational development experience. Ilana's work sits at the center of Jewish community, racial equity, and justice, and is anchored by the voices and experience of Jews of color. It is also focused on grant making, research, field building, and community education. She received her BA in sociology from California State University Humboldt and her MA in educational pedagogy from Mills College. And she was bat mitzvahed by our colleague, Marty Weiner, who is here today. So without further ado, Ilana.
Beautiful, thank you. First, I just want to thank you, Rabbi Singer, for the invitation to join you all. And so happy to see all of you here. Hello to all of my colleagues who I get to work with sometimes here in the San Francisco Bay Area and across the state and the region. And so I'm just grateful to be here and thank you for the invitation. I know many of you have to leave at 11. And so we're going to make sure we're on time. I am going to share my screen. We're going to start a conversation. And what I would just sort of say is, I'll talk for, I don't know, hopefully not too long, but I will take everyone through a formal slide presentation. And I want to invite questions and conversations as part of this process. I hope to share a lot of information that will inspire questions, curiosities, feedback, pushback, ways to grapple for the sake of our community. And I invite you to sort of chime in. I will try to track the questions, use the hand thing that Zoom provides you so I can have a visual cue. And then, you know, sometime at like, let's say 10:35, 10:40, we'll move into a much more formal question and answer process. And Rabbi Singer, I would just ask if I can't keep track of everything, if you see juicy questions in the chat, I would invite you to help me with that, if that's okay.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Beautiful. Okay. My name is Ilana Kaufman. I'm the executive director of what is now called the Jews of Color Initiative. We are in our 3rd year, and so we've shortened our name and expanded our role kind of as the story grows. It's worth saying for this group that I grew up in San Francisco, California. I was maybe starting at age 7, joined with my family, Sheretz Israel, and was bat mitzvahed with Rabbi Weiner. And I came to this work for the Jewish community in advance of this role, certainly being at the Jewish Community Relations Council. I was a program officer at the San Francisco Federation and Endowment Fund. And I was also, like I mentioned, raised in a reform context, which for the purpose of this conversation, I will touch upon a little bit. I also have the privilege of working quite a bit with the URJ. And so I have some knowledge of systems and processes that will inform and bring texture to this conversation. The Jews of Color Initiative does just 3 things for you here in the National Jewish community. We host and run the nation's only philanthropic fund focused on Jewish people of color. In our first year of grant making, we did $110,000 in grant making. In our second year of grant making, we did about $215,000 in grant making. Our first year was a pilot year. Last year, which was the end of our second formal year, we were scheduled to do $300,000 in grant making. We did $450,000 in grant making. And then this year, we'll do somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million in grant making, all focused on building out the field for Jews of color. So we focus and we invest in leadership development, standards of practice, networking and cohort building, building identity, focusing on policies and procedures and things that institutionalize systematic change, and we focus on research. The second thing we do at the initiative is we commission research for you, for the national community. And so we have the privilege of listening to your questions and then commissioning the answers to the questions. About 2 years ago, we commissioned with Professor Ari Weikelman at Stanford University, Counting Inconsistencies, which was a demographic meta-analysis of Jews of color in the United States. The two big points I'll share with you on that is we learned about how many Jews of color we can identify using the tools available to us at that time, which were the Federation's community studies and demographic studies. We also learned in that study that the federations and our leaders in the Jewish community can ask much better questions about who's in the Jewish community to help us more deeply connect those of us in the Jewish community. We are in the middle right now of our second study, a partnership between Stanford University and UC Santa Cruz. And that study, under the sort of premise of now that we know how many Jews of color there are, and I'll talk about that in just a second, the next set of questions was, what are the experiences of Jewish people of color? What are the perspectives and the perceptions out there? What do leaders need to know about experiences to inform how we create programs, right? How we design what we do. Let's get better informed. And so we're in the middle of that process now. In January, we will be launching a survey, and we think we'll be able to get at least 1,000 JOC respondents, Jews of color respondents, making that statistically very powerful. And then we will just gift all that data right back to you in the community. And then the third thing we do is we work as educators in the field. Our role, we don't do diversity training of any kind or kind of cultural competency training. Our role is to work with senior leaders, clergy, the very fine fellowships, boards of the meta organizations to help shift the paradigm from one that has generally kind of thought of ourselves as white in the US Jewish community. And we've generally had a narrative of an Ashkenazi identity, an Ashkenormative identity. The job of us at the initiative is to help leaders grapple with what it means to shift paradigms. Like when you really look at the data, when you really look what's going on with race and racism in the United States, when you really look at what's going on in the Jewish community, we need to make a shift for the sake of the integrity of the Jewish community in the United States. And our role is to help leaders think about that and grapple with that and make that work happen. Okay, let's get into the data a little bit. Let me just try to change slides here. Okay, so let's talk about the numbers, and feel free to ask some questions, and feel free to ask about what's missing or what you might be curious about. Using the number of about 7 million Jews in the United States, and we use the number 7 million to include Jewish people ages 0 to 18. And so when you're generally looking at numbers and you see that number of about 5 million United States Jews, that number is missing the young people. And why is that so important? Because there's more racial diversity as you get younger and younger across the US Jewish community. But what we know is, at a minimum, about 1 million of our 7 million Jewish community members in the United States self-identify as people of color. And in this context, what that means is we're using a US framework to think about people of color. We are operating in a US-centric context where we recognize that race and racism has a culture here in the United States, and we are steeped within that framework. So when we're talking about people of color, we're talking about people who self-identify as Black or African American, Latinx, Asian American, Native, Indigenous, First Nation, Pacific Islander, and multiracial. In that group, 12 to 15% of the 1 million Jews counted by our demographic studies self-identify as people of color. In that data, we also know that 20% of US Jewish families self-identify as multiracial. On the Pacific Coast, that number is 25%. 1 in 4 families on our coasts in this region self-identify as multiracial. What does that mean, for the purpose of this conversation? What that means is when your families are coming to your communities, coming to your synagogues, to our day schools, to our JCCs, to our differently affiliated minyanim across the West, when those multiracial families are coming to you, it might be a white family member showing up to shul, showing up to your community, but they are coming to you as a multiracial family, and they are looking at you, they're evaluating the landscape, they're feeling the vibe to figure out, is this environment racist? Is it safe for my family member? Will my children thrive here? Will they be called names when they go to Jewish summer camp? Is this environment conscious of not only the fact that we're a multiracial community, but we need to operate in anti-racist ways? And they're bringing all of that to you when they're showing up as part of their family. What about our Mizrahi and Sephardi family? The data tells us, and the counting is just as bad for Sephardim and Mizrahim as it is for Jews of color in terms of how we've counted so far in the United States, but the data tells us somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 members of our community self-identify as Mizrahim or Sephardim. And in that group, largely the Sephardim do not self-identify in the United States context as people of color. In that group, some of the Mizrahim self-identify as people of color in a US context, and we're comfortable with all that nuance. I would end this little piece by just saying, we know in our work, and we know as scholars of history, that race is a social construction. And even those Jews who are white, and I'll put that in air quotes for the purpose of this conversation, but even Jews who are white in 2020, in 2000, in 1980, in 1940, in 1930, in 1920, those same Jews were not classified as white when they came to the United States. When my mother's parents came from Poland and Romania, they were not classified as white. Nevertheless, kind of the arc of privilege over time in the United States, kind of the physics of assimilation and the physics of racism have invited Jews with European backgrounds who present with white skin to kind of fall into the background of whiteness and sort of passively accept the conditions of whiteness, and even some of the mobility tools of whiteness, like the GI Bill, which would be argued from a historical context. And so over the arc of time, Jews with 2 European parents who present white have become white in a US racial context. I'll end this piece by saying that whiteness was reminded of being conditional in 2016 in Charlottesville. And so Jews with European background can both self-identify as white, acknowledge the privilege that comes with whiteness, and recognize the tentative nature, the conditional nature of that whiteness in a context informed by white supremacy and white nationalism. I've already said a lot. Let me stop for a second. Okay. So what do these numbers tell us? Something like 1 in every 7 Jews is a person of color in the US. So then like when you're in a morning minyan, when you open your eyeballs after praying, you look around, there should be people of color in your space. If they're not, you should wonder where we are. If you think about day school classrooms, if you think about your boards, if you think about your staffs, if you think about your community events, if you think about your lay leader collectives, in each of these environments, you should see diverse people of color. The other thing I want to say, like how this all tethers together, and you all know this, there's a lot of communal funding that moves through our community to keep us intact, to keep the physics of Jewish communal engagement rolling. And in this context, when you look at all of the overall giving, particularly the institutional funding in the US Jewish community that supports all of our organizations, to give you a specific example, the US Jewish community raised $91 million for COVID relief. And many of those funds were distributed to our organizations. Of that money, if you think about proportional representation, if 12 to 15% of Jews are people of color in the United States, of those funds, 0.0049% went to Jews of color. Just to put it in context. And I would end this slide by just saying, like Maimonides, we do need to have a hierarchy, a sense of hierarchy about how we want to think about infusing resources, infusing leadership energy, infusing sort of the leadership work and capacity you all bring. We should think about really elevating and supporting Jewish people of color to support Jewish people of color. When that's not possible, we need to turn to our white colleagues and allies and bring you all in to help support the work. But at the end of the day, we should be asking Jews of color what Jews of color need to be more engaged, to lead, and to be a better integrated part of our US Jewish community. Let me just stop for, I see a question that has popped up.
Ilana, it's from
Sure.
Evan Goodman. Ilana, could you comment on Michal Bitten's recent article about Jews of color from conservative immigrant communities? She certainly places that community as Jews of color, and there's an article from JTA.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. It's a controversial article. Michal and I are colleagues. She's on our advisory committee for our research study, and so I really respect her work. I am not an expert on the Latinx perspective on this situation, nor the Sephardic perspective, but what I can tell you as informed by scholars and including my colleague Michal is some Latinx Jews self-identify as Jewish people of color and some don't. To claim that identity situates you squarely within like a US movement context. And so that's a really important thing to glean from that article. And I would say, you know, I thought the article was interesting. For me, the most interesting thing about the article is the concept of flattening ethnicity and flattening racial identity. And my big question, and Michal and I had an email exchange about it, was to what do you attribute the flattening of identity? And my perspective as a scholar is we attribute that flattening of identity to white supremacy and racism. And what I want to say about that is it's not like just people of color are negatively impacted by racism and white supremacy. And I'll also say it's not like white Jewishness exists, right? Like even sort of the Ashkenormativity, that concept is like an amalgamation of a variety of different European ethnicities and Jewish expressions into bagels and lox, into kind of how we sort of caricaturize Jewish identity. And the loss is a flattening of identity across the board. And there's a loss in there for everyone, not just Jews of color, but there's a loss in the flattening of Jewish identity in the United States for everyone. For me, that was the most interesting piece of Michal's piece. Okay, so let's just this chart is about showing you the physics of how our community will be changing and continues to change over time. The United States will be a majority people of color between 2042 and 2044. California is already a majority people of color. And so too will at some point the US Jewish community. And let me just sort of say this, why wouldn't the US Jewish community be racially diverse? Why wouldn't the US Jewish community over time become increasingly racially diverse? And just like the rest of the United States, why wouldn't we become a majority of people of color over time? The entire structure of the United States is predicated upon the assumption that people will be commingling. And the only force that keeps people away is racism and white supremacy in that context. We tried so hard to do it that we legislated it being illegal and it ended between 1969 and 1972 with the miscegenation laws in the United States. So we tried so hard to keep people of color and white people apart that we made it illegal. But the physics of this nation, the promise of this nation is predicated upon the assumption of people commingling. And there's sort of like this somewhere an intersection of either racism and exceptionalism for US Jews that has led us to think we wouldn't commingle like everyone else. And so when people look at the numbers of Jewish people of color, you're like, how did Jewish people of color come about? I've had people ask us that question. How can I believe there are so many Jewish people of color? My question is like, how could you believe there weren't? Like in a context where the entire United States, the physics relies on people commingling across race to the point where that's how our labor structures created stratification, somewhere in the middle of exceptionalism and racism, US Jews didn't realize this was us too. And so what we know is over time, the numbers will keep going up and up. The technical term is cohort replacement. And in a context of cohort replacement, each next generation of Jewish babies born is more racially diverse than the previous cohort. And so all the Jewish babies that were born yesterday, of all the Jewish babies born today, that group will be more racially hued than the group born yesterday. And so this is not like a situation of when this will happen. It's been happening around you and under your feet for the last 40, 50, and 60 years. And we have to align our organizations, our leadership, our programs with the population, with the cost of being, if we don't solve this problem, chances are US Jewish community will continue to disintegrate and become more coalesced outside of the traditional ecosystem where there are diverse people, where there are diverse families, where there are diverse Jews. Because the reality is, it's not like there aren't Jews of color engaging in Jewish life, and it's not like there aren't multiracial Jewish families engaging in Jewish life. It's that we don't rely on traditional institutions because Jewish life doesn't require that in the United States. And I know that's another conversation. Okay, so let's really talk about what this means and the impact and why this matters. Our Jewish communal leadership is almost exclusively white. And I think what we all know is just as humans, as people who thrive on role models and knowing that we have the opportunity to aspire and to see people who will push us to become who we are meant to be, we must put in place pathways to develop community leadership so that we see the full spectrum of the Jewish community in front of us. I had the, I would say the privilege and the challenge of sitting on a rabbi search committee. And the opening question to the search committee experience was for each person on the committee to talk about their, when they think of rabbi, what do they see? And I know it was a well-intentioned effort to kind of conjure up the spirit of the rabbis and on our way to sort of deliberating on how to do this search. But as the only person of color in that space, to listen to person after person after person recite their version of an older white male rabbi in a white gown kind of presiding over the community, which is a lovely, amazing, important, relevant experience in our Jewish history. But to have every single voice express that perspective demonstrates that, first of all, that's been everyone's experience and how wonderful. And the distance between that image of who we are as clergy, as who we are as the people who will lead the community, and who's out there is pretty distant. And how do we create a space so when we think of rabbi, we think of all kinds of Jews who are actually rabbis in our community? When do we close our eyes and see Rabbi Jackie Mates-Muchin? When do we close our eyes and see Rabbi Sandra Lawson? When do we close our eyes and see Rabbi Angela Bogdan? When do we talk about them as our role models, the same way we conjure up our historic ideas, and in some ways our contemporary ideas of the very traditional leaders? We also need, whoops, let's see if I can undo that. We also appreciate that community spaces are curated and through the tools and lenses informed by whiteness. And again, like, I'm not trying to like excite anybody. This is not where the heat is. Like, the heat is not about sharing the facts. We should get lit up and excited about responding to the impact of racism and anti-Semitism. But we need to curate community spaces through the lens of diverse perspectives. We need to curate spaces through the lens of diverse perspectives. There is nothing wrong with well-meaning experiences, environments, aesthetics that value sort of the historical articulation of who Jews are and what Jewish community and culture looks like. But our community is diverse, and we know we feel most welcome when there are reflections of who we are in our Jewish community spaces. And then, like I already said, we're not role modeling and we're not leading in ways that project out who people can be in our community. And we need to understand pedagogically, young people need to see images of themselves in leadership to be able to aspire toward that kind of leadership. We should feel some kind of obligation around equity and justice. And I just want to say, like, as somebody who was raised in the Reform movement, I felt tremendous learning and teaching around the Jewish values I was taught, but those Jewish values have not been a prophylactic against racism. Like, if we could just rely on Jewish values as our form of an obligation and accountability to responding to racism, I would not be here right now. And we would not be having this conversation. And so we need to just stop in the most loving way, relying on just Jewish values as our energizer to respond to racism and white supremacy. And we need to move to a real conversation that asks ourselves, how am I going to obligate myself to the work? Like, technically, tactically, like how each one of you, how will you obligate yourself to the work? And then how will you hold yourselves accountable? And then as leaders, like, we need you, I need you, you need me to be able to hold the pain and the promise of this, so that when congregants come to you and they're like, I don't know about Black Lives Matter, right? Or if they talk about an experience they have where they equate Black people with anti-Semitism, we need to be able to hold that for them and be learned about that and respond to them so that we can bring them into the process rather than pushing them away. That's our work as leaders. And then I just want to say, like, when you're thinking about counting your community, accounting for making sure every voice is represented, really making sure that people are included, we need to view not counting, and we can use that as a metaphor or literal, we need to view not counting as a crime of omission of some kind. It is a crime of omission not to include and count all Jews. We've been counting Jews since the beginning of the Torah. There are census after census after census, and each one of those censuses failed to count somebody. And like the sort of, for me, the cool arc of that is we get halakhic do-overs every couple of chapters, every couple of parshiot, we like get an opportunity to count people again. Like God gives us a chance to go like, oh, we missed women, let's do this again, right? In Numbers. And so it's not like we don't know we miss people all of the time as Jews. The Torah tells us we do that all of the time and gives us all these marks of demarcation to do it over again. And that's telling us we have an obligation to continue that process. Not only that, we have tools in Torah, in Talmud, to not only tell us how to count, but to tell us what to do so that we don't miss people. And so if you look at like the Babylonian Talmud, if you look at the text around like when you're going to count grain, God tells you you have to pray before you go in and count the grain so that you don't go in with a narrow mind. You don't go in with preconceived notions of what you're counting, and you don't miss the magic in the middle. And so it's like not enough to just be well-intentioned leaders on counting. Because if we are well-intentioned enough, we wouldn't have done such a bad job historically. And again, I mean this in the most loving way. But each one of us is obligated to know that we must count everybody, including those who are missing. And each one of us is obligated to know that we fail to have full capacity to be able to see who's missing. Our imaginations are limited, and we need to rely on tools to make sure we are expansive in our thinking rather than narrow in our thinking. And so what does it mean for all of you, for all of us, to reach into being more anti-racist, to move closer? Well, first let me say this, and if you haven't read Professor Kendi's book on how to be an anti-racist, I want to implore you to do that. If you have no patience for it, I'm going to invite you to listen to Brene Brown and Professor Kendi, their podcast. It's just 30 minutes. It's very accessible. But I need you to, if you're not there yet, to get into an anti-racist practice. And it's essential because there is no middle ground between racist and anti-racist, right? There's no neutral racist. There's no not racist. There's not no kind of sort of not really that racist. Either you're racist or you're in a posture where you're choosing to be anti-racist. And what that means is, when you see racism, and it's something to be able to have the capacity to acknowledge when racism is happening, there's value in being able to recognize that it is bad and how you might be an ally. But the anti-racist not only raises consciousness about race and racism, but in the face of racism, they take concrete action. To be an anti-racism is a verb, and it requires physics. And it requires intentionality. And so when you see the racist thing happening, you recognize it, you pause, and then you leverage your own power, your own tools, your own resources to interrupt that racism. That's what pushes one into the sphere of leaning towards anti-racist. And then let me just end with, and then we'll go into questions and answers, but let me end with 4 things you can do right now. First of all, we are all in incredibly privileged positions. And when I think about the roots of privilege and wealth, I think about just sort of the expansiveness of the resources in front of us in these roles in this community. And when I'm inviting you to think about the roots of wealth and privilege, I'm not only inviting you to think about your own, I'm thinking about who's your funders. I'm thinking about your approach to development and fundraising. I'm thinking about having ethics and integrity as related to resources and philanthropy. But I think it's very, very important to reflect on how wealth and power and privilege is acquired. And to interrogate for yourselves in the most honest and loving way if that acquisition comes from the extraction of labor, land, knowledge from people of color. And if you haven't had that conversation with yourself, with your institution, if you haven't reflected on that and made repair for that, then you're missing a foundational piece of your infrastructure to do anti-racist work. If you're interested specifically from the philanthropy lens, I would suggest you read Decolonizing Wealth by Edgar Villanueva and have that conversation with yourself. Second, I want you to get clear on your value proposition for pushing, moving, leading, leaning into being in a multiracial, multi-ethnic, anti-racist paradigm. If Jewish values were enough, if like racism is bad, white supremacy is horrible, if that were enough, then we would have already resolved the problem. Our community would be bustling with diverse families and diverse leaders of all kinds. We would be integrated into larger movements in the United States. We would have more allies across different racial backgrounds to help us respond to anti-Semitism and white nationalism and white supremacy in this country if we got clear on our if Jewish values were just enough. And so they're not. And therefore, I want to invite you, what is your value proposition for moving into this space in earnest, for real? Like standing in front of your community, standing on the bima and saying enough is enough. Enough is enough. And we have to move into this place. Is it the numbers? Like, is just the math compelling to you enough at this point? Like, if you tumble the math forward, like every one of your organizations should figure out how to be anti-racist, because you need diverse community members in your space to keep your numbers up. Like just in a very kind of talkless way, right? But if it's not about the numbers, is the value proposition for you is it halakhic? Like, is there something in text that compels you towards equity and justice in a way that you can't deny it or can't turn back? Or is it because this is about your family? Are you one of those 25% in the Bay Area in the West that represents this group who understands actually this is what keeps me and my family away in the most robust way? Have you not reconciled your own stuff around racism? And is that keeping you away from like being bold in front of your community? But it's kind of like time for each one of us to step right into the work and to have not only clarity, but pride about why we are stepping in the work the way we are, and then to communicate that out. We need leaders to lead in this area and to communicate why they're doing the work. Number 4, I think it's vital for each one of us to get brutally honest about what's at stake when, if we just sort of continue as we are, if we stay the course, if we just sort of say what we're doing is enough. Is what's at stake the fact that like our organizations, our synagogues, our community environments will become irrelevant in an environment that are all white? Like just full stop, right? Like just irrelevant. Is it enough, and is it compelling to you that if our communities are all white and they're irrelevant, that's flagging for the fact that our community is disintegrated? And like the version of Kalal Yisrael in the United States is deteriorating. Is that going to be the cost for us? Is the cost that your family will not only be unwelcome at synagogue, but when you try to go daven, your partner, if they're Black or brown, will likely be racially profiled on their way to shul. They might decide never to go back. They might be trying to daven, but have had a really horrible racist experience that's getting in the way of them actually trying to connect with God. And is that compelling to you? But like, what's at stake for each one of you if you stop right here, right now, and do nothing more? It's important to get really honest about that. We don't have to have all the tools or have all the answers, but we have to have honesty. And then the last point here is, with rigor and discipline and vigor, do all you can to actively apply multiracial, anti-racist tools, skills, thinking to make just Jewish philanthropy. And I'm using that term philanthropy in the true expanded sense of doing good for others. And I want to move away from the language of Jewish values into something more universal. And I picked that word on purpose because I want you all to think bigger. about your service, about your relationship to the other, about the relationship of your leadership to others, about the relationship of your organization to lifting up others, and go deep in the most kind of traditional sense. I want to get away from the term of Jewish values for this conversation in that way. And I want to pick something more universal and in some ways clearer. And how will you make your philanthropic work just, equitable, and right? And you cannot do it without active participation with these tools. And I want to end by saying this word rigor is essential to this work. We can sit around and kind of talk about our feelings around race and racism all we want. We can talk about kind of the impact of it all we want, but it's going to require each one of us to continue to approach this work with some discipline, like with some curricula, with some goals and objectives. And I'll end by saying with some standards of accountability. Like if we are seeing each other again in 5 years, please God, in person, and I ask you now what's different than it was 5 years ago when we met on the screen, if you tell me nothing's different, I will be disappointed and I will be sad. And more importantly, I will feel like you and I, all 32 of you or 42 of you and I will have missed an opportunity to affect change. And we cannot miss this shared opportunity to affect change. And so with that, I will stop talking and stop sharing my screen, and we can get into some questions and answers and some discussion.
Ilana, thank you so much, not only for great information that we really all need to have, but also for challenging us, which we all also need. I have a couple of short questions, a longer one. One is there some way that you can maybe send me the slides that I can share with everyone? And also a bibliography of books that people should read, or videos or podcasts or whatever people need to educate themselves with.
Yes, so Rabbi, after we do this, you and I will connect with Ricky and we'll make that stuff gets back to you.
Wonderful,
okay.
Wonderful. Okay, sure. So there's a question in the chat that I will read. Oh, wait, there are two questions. Okay, one is from Lisa Hochberg Miller. Is the title Latinx, while proposed by people of color, at its core about white need to group many groups into one title because we're not caring enough or too uneducated to know if we're talking about Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, Nicaraguans, Latinos, Hispanics, etc.?
Yes, I love that question. Thank you. I just had a meeting on Monday with a Latinx scholar who is Puerto Rican Jewish. And we had just this discussion. And so thank you for letting me pretend like I know more about this than in fact I actually do. Yes, and so I think like a couple of things. One is any collective label, including Jews of color, has been developed in response to whiteness and white identity. And so the concept of Latinx, the concept of Latino specifically, is a US invention and a white US invention. And we know that across that group, I would say not entirely dissimilar, but somewhat parallel. There's an extraordinary amount of diversity, somewhat similar to the Mizrahi and Sephardi community, and just in terms of how we think about the expansiveness of it. And there are direct relationships between, if somebody who is in the Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, I mean, there's a lot of words around it, but community, if you were raised in a country where you are Latino or Latinx, but your cultural and ethnic identity continues to be the European identity from which you came, then you generally in the US will not identify as a person of color or a Jewish person of color. But if you come from a Latinx country, for lack of a better term in this context, where you have a history of being colonized, then very much, you will self-identify as a person of color in the United States and a Jewish person of color. Age and stage-wise, the older generations will forward their general kind of Latino identity, and fewer of the older generations will self-identify as people of color. In younger generations, particularly among a large group of Latinos, there will be a Latino identity plus a national or ethnic identity, and very much across younger generations, almost exclusively, I think the percentage was 78%, are steeped in a JOC or person of color identity in the United States. So that's a great question. Thank you.
So I have a few more. So Heather Miller, can we share some of the brilliant nuggets offered here in writings and on social media? And I assume that that is okay, as long as it's
Sure.
in the name of the right
No,
person.
sure. Particularly if it's somebody else's work, please give them credit and not me. So yes.
Okay, and speaking of doing philanthropy and power well, how can we make sure that we stand up strongly to our biggest donors, trustees who pressure us away from standing up boldly and strongly? What examples have you found where people are doing this well?
That's a great question. So a number of things. One is, first, you have to stand up boldly and strongly. And so that means and again, let's pretend there's no paucity of resources out there for the purpose of at least this answer. The first piece is you and your leadership teams have to get clear on what your standards are and what your ethics are here and what your values are here. And you need to get clear about whether or not you have clarity about the fact that Black Lives Matter. You need to get clear about how you feel about when people misidentify the Black Lives Matter movement as the movement for Black Lives, who wrote the platform for Black Lives, who had 27 words in there about Israel being an apartheid state. You need to get learned about all of that so that when people come to you and they express limitations, you understand and you hear in that limitation that they're expressing a fear. And that fear usually comes from a life experience that tells them, as Jews, we have been under threat. And somewhere in here, there is a threat for me and the Jewish people. If you listen closely to the resistance, that's what's inside. Unless they're just a straight up racist, in which case they have no business in being a part of your community, quite frankly. But first, you all need to get clear about your position. We value Black lives here. We understand that we have to become more anti-racist, and it doesn't make us hyperventilate to use that kind of language. We are clear that in the United States, there is an intense history of white supremacy that cannot be denied. And we should not get excited about that word. We should get excited about the impact of white supremacy. And let's hold that colleague in that space and have those conversations. But you all need to get clear and bold and say that stuff out loud. Next to that, it is our job to bring our funders in, to bring our donors in, and to help them understand our perspectives and our value propositions. As an example, the Jews of Color Initiative, our funders, we talk about things like Zionism. We talk about whether or not Israel is an apartheid state. We talk about all of the things because if we're gonna do our work through a racially informed lens, we have to have those conversations. You get to too. And you get to invite your funders in. And let me separate out and say just two more things. One is, everywhere in this conversation around race, Jews of color, our diverse Jewish community, everywhere in that conversation is an entry point for every member of your community. If your community members don't have people of color in their families yet, the data tells us they're one grandbaby or one baby cousin away from being part of that 25% of multiracial Jewish families. And so it is vital to recognize that everyone has an entry point, whether or not they know it, and how can you help them see it? And how do you leverage those relationships to help move them away from fear? I appreciate that funding is vital, but there's very little to object to in this work if you as the leader are clear on your value proposition, why it's important to your community, and the very real fears we have fomented as part of the United States, the Jewish community notwithstanding. So of course, some Jews have had experiences of racism. Who are racist or have perspectives of Black people, for example. Of course, there are Jews who have experienced lots of anti-Semitism from people of color, but that is not the story. That is not the story. So how do you help tell the real story while recognizing that people have very real experiences? I will close by saying There are so many institutional funders in this country who are supporting reform synagogues to do work around diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. The reform movement itself is investing a lot of resources. And so I think like more and more, if you are encountering headwind after headwind in terms of connecting with donors and funders, I want to, and we could, I don't want to make any promises, but like, I want to encourage you to sort of step back a little bit and get broader just because the funding community is changing, and it's only changing because we're inviting people into the conversations and having the hard conversations. So first you have to get bold, and then we can support people in coming in rather than pushing them out.
So I think this is related to that question from Miriam Phillips. How do you uncover the quote colonial and racist roots in your own synagogue? Is there such a thing as a racism audit for congregations?
Yes, that's a great question. Colleagues like April Baskin at Joyous Justice have done this for some of the synagogues out there. And so I think that's a great question. And I think like, I would say go in with like the joy of a social scientist, right? Like, of course, we've all played parts in the system. Like, of course. And so like, what can we discover about the history of our organizations, our communities, our geography that will help us tell our story better? That will help us know ourselves better? That will help us reveal some of the vestiges that might express now as challenges. And so yes, colleagues like April Baskin can be really helpful, joyousjustice.com, I think. And I would say like, seize that as an invitation to get connected to your organization's history, to tell your story better, and then to extend the history with new chapters, to not do away with that history. So that's the last thing I want to say is history is really, really important. I'm in Berkeley, California, the train is going by. History is really, really important. And when people resist sort of expanding our story, part of the fear is that we're gonna close the chapters of our history. I want to encourage you to tell the stories of your synagogues, tell the stories of your neighborhoods, tell the stories of your communities. It not only makes your community's members closer to your own history, it helps your community around your community understand your history. And that all knits communities together. That's a knitting activity.
Thank you. So I don't know, Evan, is this a question or just a statement that from that Michal Biton article regarding Latinx?
That was just when Lisa asked that question, I just threw that in there.
Oh, okay. Just that 97% of American Hispanics don't use the term Latinx, which is kind of interesting. But that's related to what Lisa was asking about. There's some other helpful things in here. Jill Perlman's High Holiday Sermon on how to be an anti-racist has been recommended. And Lisa asked again, do you have statistics in multiracial families that identify as Jewish? How many of those families are also interfaith? And doesn't that give us a fuller picture of the challenges we must address?
Great questions. The Jewish community has not collected that data. And so when you think about like all the community studies that your federations have done, they haven't asked any of those questions. And so we don't actually have quantitative statistics on multiracial Jewish families. I can tell you what we've learned in the field. Of the racially diverse Jews of color out there, the majority and the number that will grow the fastest are multiracial Jewish families. And so that's just a very important data point. It's parallel structure to the rest of the United States. And so that will be your fastest growing population. What's interesting about that as planners and strategists and thinkers is that population is within a context where it is Black and brown racism and racial identity that kind of informs the racial justice movement. So you're holding kind of two different juicy pieces there, which is like you have this growing population of multiracial Jewish families, but the pedagogy, if you will, the canon of anti-racist work is steeped from and stems from anti-racist work specifically in relation to Black and brown people. The populations of Jews of color, we have multiracial Jewish families, we have white Jewish families who have adopted children, and largely those families have adopted children from Central America, China, and Ethiopia. We have monoracial Jewish families of color that might be interracial, so like Asian and Black for example. And then we have monoracial Jewish families, like families with 2 Black parents that have been Jewish. In this case, this family I'm thinking of, Orthodox for 8 generations here in the United States. And so that's a large group. You have a whole swath of modern Orthodox Jewish people of color that's pretty significant and substantial out there. And then you have a whole group of like renewal and reconstructionists out there. We see in terms of geography, the coasts are overpopulated, but we have in terms of our week, we have Nebraska, all over the country, including like Nebraska, the Carolinas. There are Jews of color all over the country, as you would imagine. And in terms of interfaith, what's really interesting is, and again, that data was not counted in the community studies from the federations, but what's really interesting about the interfaith families, and we work a little bit with 18 Doors, you have families who are technically interfaith because they have one parent who's Jewish and one parent who's of a different faith, but they don't identify as interfaith because they're a Jewish family. And we don't track that. And then you have families who truly identify as interfaith, or I would even say multi-faith. And Pew told us a little bit about that in their last study, but either interfaith because they really do have multiple faiths in that household, or multi-faith because they practice multiple faiths in that household. So we've seen those 3 expressions in our work.
And Julie Sachs-Toller gave us a website to go to from the URJ, which is trying to get us to get into these conversations and actions. And let's see if there are other questions. Do you have recommendations to help? This is from Jason Levine, and this will be the last question because I know you have to go. Do you have recommendations to help us work with board members, staff members, ourselves, et cetera, who tend to see their anti-racist work as significant, but frankly is largely performative and not moving into the more meaningful work that you were speaking about?
So yeah, I mean, my recommendation would be to work with the organizational leaders, meaning senior staff and board, to actually create a structure for your staff and your community. Like, what is your plan? What are you going to hold them accountable to? Just like if you were implementing any new initiative in your community, you would create a strategic plan. And I'm not saying like spend 3 years making a plan. I'm saying you would create a plan. You would put goals and objectives in there and tools of accountability and metrics. And then you would train your staff and then help give them the support they need to be held accountable to the goals and objectives and the metrics. And in that way, it's just as much a pragmatic exercise as it is a spiritual exercise. And so you could either yourselves or hire somebody to like get down and have the conversation about what it looks like to do growth over time. There are different organizations and different synagogues in the URJ movement who have done some of that work, who can serve as kind of models in that way. But it's very, very important, like to create, like, first of all, if people don't see it as their work, and I mean this in the most loving way, then we as leaders have not made it compelling, and we have not made it important, and we have not invited them in to the importance of the work. And so that's on us as leaders, and there's an invitation there for everybody. And then in terms of like a performance and being performative, like it's up to us to make it meaningful for them. And then it's up to us to hold them accountable to it. In the same way you would hold somebody accountable to like being excellent with their budgets or being excellent with their program management, you have to bring the same pragmatic and practical nature to the implementation of these kinds of efforts and initiatives.
Ilana, thank you so much. This has been so important for all of us, and we'll continue the conversation. Absolutely.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It was my privilege to spend the morning with all of you. Take good care, everybody. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to pass it back to Evan as we are going to continue the program briefly. Hope you can stay on for the Askara. Evan.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Ilana's just left, but thank you both for putting together a wonderful program and for taking us out of the Palm Springs space into a meaningful use of our hour and a quarter. And it is an hour and a quarter because we're going to spend a few minutes now remembering one of our colleagues. So I'd like to turn this over to Steve Chester, who will remember Sam Browdy.
Evan, thank you very much. And Ilana, thank you. I feel honored to deliver the Askara for my friend and colleague and predecessor and emeritus, Rabbi Sam Brody, who was often called Shmuel and was called by me, as we had a wonderful relationship, Shmoo. He died at 95 years old, as did his wife. Sam was born in Chicago, and he was one of 8 siblings. His upbringing was basically Orthodox. From 6 years on, he went to Cheder for an hour and a half after school. As he said in his memoir, Listening to the Voice, my Cheder experience had given me a grounding in Hebrew, the early prophets, Rashi, Jewish history, and perhaps most important, a respect for Jewish learning and Jewish identity. Sam never lost this. He was a scholar and a font of Jewish knowledge and text. Sam said he wanted to be a rabbi at 11 years old. He first entered formal Jewish life as a religious school teacher, and then as a cantorial soloist at University Synagogue in Los Angeles. He then decided to go to HUC, where he was ordained in 1960. His first pulpit was at Fairmount Temple in Cleveland, and he became rabbi in Oakland at Temple Sinai in 1966 until his retirement in 1989, where he became Rabbi Emeritus. Sam was not only an excellent teacher and scholar, he was both passionate and compassionate. He was very active in anti-Vietnam War efforts and in the civil rights movement. He made Temple Sinai into a sanctuary congregation. When the community wanted Jewish representation at a protest or a rally, it was Sam they called on all of the time. He made Temple Sinai the Jewish calling card for civil justice in Oakland. His passion was tikkun olam, but another passion he had as an aside was tennis. He loved to play tennis, and in the olden days when we used to have the par tennis tournament, he would often be paired with Rabbi Kelter, and they would try to win the championship every time. Sam was also funny, compassionate, and a storyteller. He loved to tell stories. Often in his sermons or teaching, he would digress and start telling a story. Sometimes it applied to his subject matter, and sometimes, very honestly, it did not. However, his stories were always entertaining, and one of his favorite sayings when he wished to speak was, "I'll be short but brief." Few were the times that this turned out to be the case when Sam started speaking. Sam and his wife were married for almost 70 years. They had 2 children, 3 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren. They were the center of Sam and Judith's life. Marriage was a love story and ended like a love story, almost Romeo and Juliet-esque. They died within 3 days of one another at 95 years old. I loved Sam Brody. I loved his passion. I loved his emotion. I loved his social activism. I loved his stories and his sense of humor. And for me, he was a wonderful emeritus, always warm, helpful, kind, and positive about what was going on in the congregation, and very encouraging. He taught me how to be a positive and a supportive emeritus. I feel blessed to have him as the Rabbi Emeritus in the congregation that I served in Oakland. Sam wrote his memoirs entitled Listening to the Voice, and he also did a one-man show of the same name. And if you can find it somewhere, it is delightful to watch. Sam ends his memoirs telling about a theater workshop he was in after retiring. They were discussing the story of Jacob and wrestling with the messenger, with the angel. But he called this wrestling match the other, or maybe even himself. And he writes, and I quote, "I try to imagine myself as Jacob, as I strained to hear the other's blessing. What I heard when that blessing from the other was I have given you a beautiful Judith with all the years of together, friendship, and love. I have given you 2 wonderful children, 3 wonderful grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren. I heard the other with whom I was wrestling say, I enabled you to fulfill the promise of becoming a rabbi in Israel, and I did this for you without a change of name, simply by your becoming and being your true self. There could be no greater a blessing." Samuel Brody was a true blessing for all who knew and loved him. Shmuel ben Meir ve'Esther. For those who wish and who are able, to stand for Kaddish. And let us just join together. Yitkadau v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah. V'alma divrach hirutei v'yamlich malchutei. V'chayechonu v'yomechonu v'chayei dechal beit Yisrael. V'agala u'vizman kariv v'imru. Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach la'olam olamei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitba'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalal shmei dekudisha barichu. Ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tushbechata v'nechemata. V'amiran bi'alma v'imru. Amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim. V'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen.
Amen.
Shalom biromav. Uyaseh shalom. Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael.
Oh, yes,
V'imru.
Amen.
Steve, that was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you to all who are still on the call. We peaked at 52 colleagues here with us. So that's a real blessing to be here to learn together with one another and to remember Sam as well.